Think about the language you are speaking right now, or the one your parents whispered to you at night, or the one printed on the currency in your wallet. Most people assume that language is just noise, just sound, just a tool that appeared out of nowhere the moment humans needed to talk to each other. But what if I told you that nearly half the human race, from a farmer in Punjab to a taxi driver in Dublin, from a grandmother in Tehran to a teenager in Oslo, is unknowingly speaking dialects of a single ghost language that vanished off the face of the earth almost 6,000 years ago? What if the words you use for mother, for father, for fire, for wheel, were whispered first by a small, forgotten group of horse-riding herders on a windswept steppe, people whose bones were only recently pulled out of the ground and forced, after 5,000 years of silence, to finally tell the truth? By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly who these people were, where they actually came from, why 200 years of scholars got the story almost right, but not quite, and how a 2025 genetic bombshell, built from over 400 ancient skeletons, finally answered one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in human history. You will never look at your own native language the same way again. If mysteries like this, the kind that sit hidden in fossils, in genomes, in dusty grave mounds, genuinely fascinate you, hit subscribe now. Because every week on this channel we dig into exactly this kind of forgotten history, the stories that rewrite what we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. The story of this mystery does not begin with a scientist in a lab coat. It begins in 1786 in Calcutta with a British judge named Sir William Jones. Jones was a linguist obsessed with Sanskrit, and while studying it he noticed something that should not have been possible. Sanskrit, the ancient sacred language of India, shared a strange and unmistakable resemblance with Latin, with Greek, and with the Germanic and Celtic languages of Europe. The words for numbers matched. The grammar matched. Even the words for family relationships matched, as though these languages, separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, had once been the same tongue. Jones proposed something radical for his time, that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin must have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. That common vanished source would later be given a name, Proto-Indo-European, and the hunt for its birthplace would become one of the longest-running detective stories in the history of science, stretching across 2 full centuries, dozens of countries, and eventually the entire field of ancient genetics. For decades, actually for the better part of 2 centuries, the world of archaeologists and linguists split into 2 rival camps, each certain the other was wrong. The first camp backed what became known as the Steppe hypothesis. It proposed that Proto-Indo-European was born around 6,000 years ago on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast belt of grassland stretching from Ukraine into southern Russia and Kazakhstan, and that it was carried outward by tough, mobile herders who had tamed the horse and invented wheeled wagons. The second camp backed the Anatolian, or farming, hypothesis, which argued for a much older origin, closer to 9,000 years ago, tied to the first farmers who spread out of Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, carrying agriculture and language together as they expanded into Europe. For generations, this debate could not be settled, because the only evidence available was linguistic reconstruction and pottery shards, and both camps could bend that evidence to fit their theory. Entire academic careers were built defending one side or the other, and the arguments grew so heated, so tangled in old European nationalism and colonial politics, that the search for the Indo-European homeland briefly became one of the most politically radioactive topics in all of archaeology, partly because of how badly it had been abused in the past. But that old deadlock finally broke, not because of a clever new argument, but because of mud. Specifically because of the DNA locked inside human bones that had been sitting in burial mounds across Russia and Ukraine for thousands of years. When ancient DNA sequencing technology matured enough to extract usable genetic material from teeth and inner ear bones, Scientists suddenly had a tool neither the Steppe camp nor the Anatolian camp ever had access to, an actual, physical, unforgeable record of who these ancient people were related to, who they migrated with, and who they left descendants among. In February 2025, a landmark study led by geneticist Iosif Lazaridis, working with veteran Indo-European archaeologist David Anthony and the legendary population geneticist David Reich, was published in Nature, and it analyzed the genomes of more than 400 ancient individuals, most of them freshly excavated from Russia and Ukraine. What they found did not simply confirm the old steppe hypothesis. It went further and quieter, and stranger than anyone expected, tracing the roots of the Yamnaya people. The herders most linguists already suspected were Proto-Indo-European speakers, back to an even earlier population nobody had properly named before. This earlier population is now called the Caucasus-Volga people, or CLV for short, and understanding them is the key to understanding everything that follows. Around 4,400 to 4,000 BCE, in the flatlands stretching between the North Caucasus Mountains and the lower Volga River in modern southern Russia, two very different groups of ancient humans began mixing together. One group carried what geneticists call Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, tied to populations from the mountains and valleys south of the Caucasus Range. The other group carried Eastern European hunter-gatherer ancestry, tied to the older populations who had roamed the open steppe for thousands of years before farming ever reached them. These two populations came together, intermarried, and produced a genetically blended community that anthropologists can now trace with startling precision across dozens of individual skeletons. You are looking in these bones at the literal biological ancestors of hundreds of millions of living people. You are looking at the genetic seed from which the Yamnaya would grow. You are looking at what may be the very first speakers of the language that eventually split into English, Hindi, Persian, Russian, Spanish, Bengali, and more than 400 other tongues. Sites like Nalchik, dated to roughly 4900 BCE, and Remont Noi, dated to around 3900 BCE, preserve some of the clearest snapshots of this blending in progress, and the genetic line running between these sites shows bidirectional movement, meaning people and genes flowed both north and south across this frontier zone for centuries, slowly creating a shared ancestral population out of two once separate worlds. The researchers behind the 2025 study argue that this Caucasus Lower Volga population is where the language ancestral to both the Anatolian branch and the wider Indo-European branch, what they call Proto-Indo-Anatolian, was still spoken as a single, unified tongue sometime in that narrow window between 4,400 and 4,000 BCE. That is a strikingly specific claim, and it matters because it pushes the timeline of unity earlier than the pure steppe hypothesis originally proposed, while still keeping the geography rooted firmly in the steppe Caucasus borderlands rather than deep inside Anatolia itself. It is a hybrid answer that neither of the old rival camps had fully predicted, built not on pottery styles or vocabulary lists, but on the cold, hard architecture of human DNA extracted from graves that had been undisturbed for 6,000 years. From this Caucasus Lower Volga foundation, the story moves north and west into the open grasslands where a new archaeological culture was taking shape, known as the Seredny-Sti culture, centered in the Dnipro-Don River region of what is now war-torn eastern Ukraine. According to the newest genetic reconstructions, it is this Seredny-Sti population, descended from the CLV people, that represents the true homeland of the core Indo-European branch, the language family that would eventually split into everything from Germanic to Slavic to Indo-Iranian. Around 3300 BCE, out of this Seredny-Sti world, a new archaeological complex explosively appears across the record, and archaeologists call it Yamnaya, from the Russian word for pit, referring to their distinctive pit-grave burial mounds, or kurgans, that still dot the landscape of Ukraine and southern Russia today. You are looking at a population that domesticated the horse. You are looking at a population that mastered the wheeled wagon, allowing them to move households, herds, and entire families across vast distances of open grassland that had previously been nearly impossible to cross on foot. You are looking at a population that, within just a few centuries, expanded from a relatively small ancestral community into a genetic and cultural presence stretching from Hungary in the west all the way to Kazakhstan in the east, an almost unimaginable speed of expansion for the ancient world. One of the most striking findings from the newest research is that the genetic distance between Yamnaya and their Seredny Sti ancestors is remarkably small, meaning the Yamnaya were not some entirely new invading population sweeping in from elsewhere, but essentially the direct genetic and cultural continuation of the people who had already been living in that Dnipro-Don corridor. This matters enormously because it means the search for the specific birthplace of core Indo-European has narrowed down to an almost shockingly precise location. Researchers involved in the study have pointed to the area near the small town of Mikhailivka in southern Ukraine as a strong candidate for where this pivotal population first took root, a detail made almost eerie by the fact that this exact region has, in the last several years, become one of the most heavily fought-over stretches of land on the planet. David Anthony, one of the study's senior authors, has noted the strange, uncomfortable irony that the origin point of a language family spoken by billions of people today sits in the middle of an active modern war zone, a place where the deep past and a violent present are, quite literally, occupying the same coordinates on a map. But the Yamnaya story alone does not explain everything, and this is where the mystery gets genuinely stranger. There is one branch of the Indo-European family that behaves like an outlier, refusing to fit neatly into the northern steppe narrative, and that branch is Anatolian, the extinct language family that includes Hittite, once spoken by a powerful empire in what is now Turkey. Genetic evidence increasingly suggests that the Anatolian branch did not emerge directly from the classic Yamnaya expansion at all, but instead split off earlier, tracing a separate path southward from the shared Caucasus-Lower Volga ancestral pool, moving through the Caucasus region and eventually into Anatolia by a route scholars are still actively debating and have not yet fully resolved. This unresolved question is exactly why the story is not a closed case, no matter how confident any single headline sounds. A rival team led by researchers connected to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, including linguist Paul Hegarty, has pushed back hard against parts of the Lazaridis interpretation, arguing for what they call a hybrid hypothesis, in which the ultimate homeland of the entire Indo-European family sits even further south, immediately below the Caucasus Mountains, with the language family beginning to diverge as early as roughly 800 years ago, long before the Yamnaya even existed as a distinct group, and only later sending a branch northward onto the steppe as a secondary homeland for the languages that eventually reached Europe. This is not a minor academic footnote, it is a genuine, ongoing scientific fight playing out in real time across competing papers, rebuttal commentaries, and conference talks. Hegarty has directly challenged the Lazaridis team's framing, arguing in a sharply worded response that the new Nature paper, despite its genetic sophistication, actually represents a quiet retreat from the pure steppe hypothesis rather than a confirmation of it, because the deepest ancestral roots it identifies point south of the steppe, toward the Caucasus and the Fertile Crescent, rather than confirming the steppe itself as the ultimate point of origin. You are watching, in real time, one of the last great unresolved arguments in historical linguistics, playing out not with dusty manuscripts but with genome sequencers and statistical population models. You're watching geneticists and linguists, two fields that used to barely speak to each other, forced now into direct, sometimes tense, collaboration because neither field alone can fully answer the question. You are watching a 200-year-old mystery get narrowed down to a difference of a few hundred kilometers and a few centuries, which, on the timescale of human prehistory, counts as an almost absurd level of precision. There is also a darker layer to this story that cannot be skipped, because the search for the Indo-European homeland has not always been a neutral, purely academic pursuit. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of a single ancient Indo-European or Aryan homeland was violently distorted by nationalist and racist ideologies, most infamously by the Nazi regime, which twisted the linguistic concept of a shared ancestral language into a pseudoscientific myth about a biologically superior Aryan race that supposedly spread civilization across Eurasia. This historical abuse is part of why, for decades after World War II, many serious scholars became deeply cautious, even reluctant, to publicly speculate about Indo-European origins at all, worried about how easily the topic could be hijacked again for ideological purposes. The new genetic research actually dismantles that old racist myth, rather than supporting it, revealing a far messier, far more human story of small, mixed, intermarrying populations gradually blending together over centuries, not some pure singular master race sweeping across continents. The Yamnaya themselves were already a genetic blend before they ever began expanding, carrying ancestry from at least 2 or 3 earlier distinct populations, which means the entire premise of ethnic purity collapses the moment you actually look at the DNA. What makes this discovery matter to you personally right now, sitting wherever you are watching this, is the sheer scale of its reach into the present day. Indo-European languages are spoken today by more than 40% of the entire human population, spanning English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Russian, Hindi, Bengali, Urdu, Persian, Punjabi, and dozens upon dozens more. An almost incomprehensible linguistic empire built from a single small population of Bronze Age herders who never could have imagined the scale of what they were starting. You are, statistically, more likely than not to be speaking a language descended from this ancient steppe Caucasus lineage right now. You are, whether you realize it or not, carrying grammatical structures, kinship terms, and even numbering systems that trace back to people who lived and died more than 5,000 years before you were born. You are part of one of the largest unbroken cultural through lines in the entire history of our species, connected by nothing more solid than sound, syntax, and the accident of which ancestors happen to survive and multiply. Your native language is not just a tool for ordering coffee or arguing with your family. It is a fossil, every bit as real and as ancient as the bones being pulled out of Ukrainian and Russian burial mounds right now, a fossil made not of stone or calcium, but of sound patterns passed mouth to mouth, unbroken for over 6,000 years. Every time you say a word for mother or father or count from 1 to 10, you are participating in an act of memory so old that the people who first spoke those root sounds did not know what a wheel was until they invented it, did not know what a horse could carry until they tamed it, and could never have imagined that their small, mixed, mortal community on a windswept grassland would one day echo through the mouths of billions of people they would never meet, across continents they never knew existed. History is usually written in stone monuments and grand empires, but this particular story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful, most far-reaching human inheritance is not a monument at all. It is simply the sound of a sentence, carried forward generation after generation, until it becomes almost everyone's native tongue.